Rohini has so much brilliance to share with all of us in the field today. And Rohini couldn't be interviewed by a better person than Tanya Cruz Teller, also a longtime friend of Khalil Jamison. We are happy to continue supporting the work of the Center for Global Inclusion and look forward to what promises to be a stimulating conversation with Rohini and Tanya. Thank you, Khalil Jamison. So let's shift our focus here to our wonderful facilitator, our shepherdess, Tanya Cruz Teller. Tanya's 20 plus years of international and organization development work is committed to a diverse, equitable, and inclusive world through building great organizations. She champions strength-based design in strategic planning, leadership development, and stakeholder engagement, and specializes in blended synchronous and asynchronous online engagements that maximize inclusion, innovation, and inspired action. Her career in the international organization development and diversity arenas also includes her role as an expert panelist of the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarks, which has been published every 4 to 6 years since 2006. In addition to co-authoring her book, Thriving Women, Thriving World, An Invitation to Dialogue, Healing, and Inspired Actions, Tanya's appreciative leadership work in South Africa was just published by Routledge in the book, Inclusive Leadership, Transforming Diverse Lives, Organizations, and Societies. Tanya is with us from her home in Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a wonderful welcome. And it is so beautiful to see all the hellos in the chat. Keep them coming. Great to see where everybody's coming from. And really a big thank you to the center for hosting us, for creating this free webinar. It is made possible by sponsors and donors, ensuring that webinars like this and the great GDEIB are benchmarks that we put hundreds, sometimes it feels like thousands of hours towards for free as expert panelists that Rohini and I are, and quite a number that I see here who are joining us from around the world are doing. And so if you'd like to join this esteemed group of sponsors and donors, please do so. Greg will post in the chat a link in the website. We'd love to have you be a part of helping us keep these resources and these wonderful events for free. And since you're joining this webinar, which is really wonderful, you'll get to hear more about wonderful things coming from the center through the newsletter. So please look for that and look forward to that. And there'll be more posts in the chat from Greg. So if you need any resources, please feel free to reach out and click there. So without further ado, it is really my absolute honor to introduce a dear colleague and friend in this DEI journey, Dr. Rohini Anand. Rohini was the former SVP of Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo, which is an incredible global food and facilities management company with close to 500,000 employees in over 80 countries. And what's really amazing, and we're going to hear more, is how she took the company from class action to best in class. So Sodexo became recognized for its DEI leadership under Rohini. Rohini is also on several for-profit and nonprofit boards and just published her book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So we're incredibly excited to be able to hear more. And she has availed an excerpt from her book for free, and we've posted that into the chat, so you can feel free to click on that link. And also I really encourage you to read the entire book. It is chock full of stories and charts and incredible resources. So you can read more about it in the chat. So I want to welcome you, Rohini. It's so great to have you.
Thank you, Tanya. It's terrific to be here. And I too want to thank the center, want to thank the Khalil Jamison Group This is a great opportunity. It's wonderful to see so many of you from all around the world. I know, there were hundreds that registered. And I have to say, Tanya, that this is the first book launch. So it's extra special for me because this is the first. And also it comes in the heels of my daughter's wedding. So if you can see my henna, this is from her wedding. And it was just a couple of days ago. So I'm getting my, shifting gear now, but I'm just really delighted to be here and to, to learn from you all and to, share dialogue with you, Tanya. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. Perfect timing. You're shepherdessing your daughter into new possibilities and new life. And same with your book. It's such an honor.
I like that shepherdess piece. I might steal it. It's good.
This is why we're gathered. We're gathered to share with each other our gifts and our insights and our terms and our points of view and experiences. So happy for you to use that. And I have to say, when I was reading your book, one of the things that I was really struck was the stories that people told and that you told on their behalf of how they came to this DEI journey. And some of them are very private, right? So depending on the culture, you talked about, certain cultures are private and you're able to share some of them and others are public. And so I'm wondering if you would kick us off by sharing your DEI story. What brought you?
So Tanya, I think this work, as everyone on this call knows, is very, very personal. And it's extremely personal to me, obviously. We all have a DEI journey, and my story is, very integral to who I am. So I grew up in India, surrounded by people who look like me, and I belong to the majority religion, Hinduism. And I had the privilege of really not thinking about my identity. And as a teenager, I moved to the United States. I moved to North America, and that was an inflection point in my journey. My identity shifted from someone who saw herself as a center of the world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, to being a foreigner. And that change in identity to being perceived as a minority, and I learned to recognize myself as such, made me realize the privileges that come with being a part of the majority. I hadn't recognized those privileges when I was part of the majority, and I was really unable to till I experienced being a minority. So, for me, the realization was that identity is situational, it's fluid, and that really informs the work that I do today. And this work is very personal to me. It is who I am. It's, I say that my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned. And what it means to be a minority is really at the core, at the heart of DEI work. So my story was, my journey from India to the US. Actually, my father had moved to the United States in the 40s, and he had experienced discrimination. He was in California, but traveled through the South and experienced discrimination. And I have to say, to his credit, he encouraged me to go to the United States for my master's and never shared some of those negative stories with me. He had a very sort of eclectic career and ended up working in Hollywood with the likes of Cary Grant, et cetera, after getting a scholarship to the US. And he shared sort of the positive pieces. And it was up to me to really discover my own journey and my oown identity as I moved here. So that's my story.
That's beautiful. And I love that you dedicated your book to your father. And you said, he believed in the book before you even did. So
nice, Tanya, you remember that. That's awesome. Thank you.
Is very touching. So I'm wondering if you can share, why did you decide to write the book, and some of the questions that we were getting. Thank you to the participants who wrote in questions. We looked them over and they were really helpful. A lot of people wanted to know, like, what were you most proud of? And, looking back over your career, your joys, your regrets. So I'm sure that all mixed into why now, why the book?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of reasons as to why now and why the book at this point in time. And I think many of you will agree that progress in DEI has been slow. There have been performative statements that have been made, a flurry of activities with chief diversity officers and diversity professionals appointed, CEOs have made commitments, and in the United States, corporate CEOs have donated over $200 billion to address racial justice issues. And I think that's great. But I do think it's time for us to move from situational action to really sort of sustainable progress. And we have an opportunity, we have a moment. And in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and other African-American men and women in the United States who were murdered, and this movement going viral, we really have to be more ambitious, and we have to unfreeze the way we've been doing things. But the question becomes how, and I know that when I was doing this work, I actually yearned for sort of a practical book on doing global DEI work. I know that global DEI got the most interest and the most frustration and the most questions for guidance. How do we do this? What's the best way of doing this? And then, so I kind of rewired from Sodexo in January of 2020, and then COVID hit. So I used that as an opportunity to hunker down and to really write what I had learned. So this book is not an academic book. It's based on my lived experience. And it's based on someone who sort of had to pioneer a way forward without any real map. So for me, it's an act of giving back. It's an act of, sort of consolidating what I had learned. And there are many hard lessons that I learned, through the process. So I want to give back what I have learned to those of you here on this call who really do the heavy lifting and the hard work of making organizations more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And there are many, many mistakes that I made along the way. So it was my opportunity to share some of those and what I had learned, so you don't have to repeat some of those mistakes. And if I can, Tanya, I'm going to share one of those, stories. So, I lived in the United States for a couple of decades, and we were very successful in doing DEI work in the United States, in North America, actually. And then, I went back with Sodexo to India to see what we could do there and to really launch the work there. And I will never forget that I sat in this room in the Sodexo offices in Mumbai, small room with about 20 women in mid-level management. And, we were talking about how they should advance their careers and what we could do to support them. And here I went off, based on my experiences in the US, and I talked about mentoring and sponsorship and leadership development. And I was just met with these blank stares. Something was clearly not connecting. I tried a few words in Hindi, still nothing. And then I paused and I took a breath and I said, can you help me understand what we can do to help you with your careers in Sodexo? And it was at that moment where one of the women actually raised her hand and she said, Rohini ma'am, we have to go home. We can't stay late, even if we want to work on projects, because we have to do the housework, we have to cook dinner, and our mother-in-laws expect us to be on time, etc. And then they were on a roll and they shared their experiences. And I have to say that I had forgotten clearly the dynamic of the multi-generational families in India. I had forgotten the dynamic of couples, of women living with their families, with their in-laws, with their husbands' parents, and extended families. And I had completely forgotten the role of the Indian woman, not only as a wife and a mother, but also as a daughter-in-law. And clearly I had forgotten my limitations as a multidimensional being, because I was focused on that one aspect of shared identity and I had overlooked the other aspects. So it was one of my early lessons that, not to export things that had worked at home, and also an early lesson to do my own work. So, so it's those kinds of lessons that I shared, because we're all a work in progress. And in terms of joy, you asked me about, what gives me the most joy. I will say that to me, change happens at the intersection of the personal and the systemic. And it's the personal, the people that I have impacted that gives me the greatest joy, whether it's careers that have been advanced as a result of the work that I've done, or if it's mindsets that have been changed to the extent that, there's one CEO who basically, said to me that this is nonsense, it's a waste of time. And at the end of his tenure, the only thing he chose to do was to be on diversity, equity, and inclusion advisory boards. So it's changed mindsets and careers that I have advanced that gives me the most joy, because, change does happen at the intersection of that personal and systemic, and we can impact both, but clearly, for me, that impacting people gives me the most joy. So let me just stop there.
That's wonderful. I think one of the things that I appreciate about your leadership and also your writing is how you share your learning so freely, where you bumped your head, where you had your own cultural norms, where you juggled and balanced. How do you bring external cultures and internal cultures and bring them together? And so I'm wondering, from your learning, from your writing, if you can share your 5 principles, what you learned and what you outlined of how organizations can create these inclusive cultures, whether they're in a single country or they're multinational, really goes across the board.
Yeah, and I think just one comment on what you just said, Tanya, in terms of, sharing the stories. So clearly, when I started writing the book, I wanted to do something which was more of a how-to book. And what I realized was that what was more important was to share the stories behind the how-to. So there's sort of 2 strands of stories that I share. One is these lessons learned, because, all of us are a work in progress. And it's the changes, the challenges that really brought me the greatest insights and the most lasting change. And the second is my own journey, as a young immigrant woman coming to North America, and how I basically evolved in my own DEI journey. Because, we have to disrupt our own worldviews in order to be able to disrupt and transform others. So with that, I would say that, doing this work, I've realized that there's really no checklist or cookbook. There's no, it's not enough to have a list of initiatives or best practices. But I did realize that there were sort of principles that provide a through line to doing this work. And these principles are gathered through, decades of my experience. And each principle here that you see on the slide is a simple statement. But it's really imbued with the fullness of experiences, not only mine, but those of colleagues and stories and anecdotes. But it doesn't provide standards based on what's worked in one country, because what's unique about these principles is that they can be applied with cultural sensitivity to any cultural context. And leaders don't have to mimic any one country. They can actually use it and develop their own solutions. And they can be translated using multiple sort of cultural frameworks, if you will. So here are the 5 principles. Make it local is the first. Leaders change to lead change is the second. And it's good business too is the third. Go deep, wide, and inside out is the fourth. And know what matters and count it is the fifth. So what I'm going to do is to actually talk a little bit about each one of these, if that's okay with you, Tanya. So the first one, make it local, is really about anchoring your change initiatives in the local context. And I think we can take that slide off if you want, if folks have kind of gotten it. So it's really about, the history, the culture, the laws and language in a local context. And with that understanding, what's important is to really push for change, but do so with local change agents. Because, how identity is defined, power dynamics, dominant subordinate groups obviously differ from one context to the other. And there are different approaches to doing this work. So one of the ones that I sort of prefer, and I'm going to talk about that, but the 3 that I actually mentioned in the book, one is the universal approach, which basically has a centralized sort of top-down policy, which is implemented regardless of the context in any country or local environment. The second is local, which basically is designed in country for a specific context. And it's great, it's very, very local, but it can be inconsistent because it doesn't bring sort of best practices to inform, and there's no sharing across. And there's also no sort of consistent branding. Now, one example of the sort of universal approach is a food delivery system in North America. And they had the best of intentions. What they decided was that they were going to give a LGBTQ sort of badge to all their employees around the world to demonstrate that they were allies to those that were to the LGBTQ employees in their locations. And this was distributed worldwide, which, really good intentions to make allies visible, to say this is a safe place for LGBTQ employees, etc. But what happened was in Egypt, where it's illegal to have same-sex relationships, the employees were very concerned and didn't want to use those symbols because they were, they didn't want to be outed in any way. So clearly this was, a universal approach with very good intentions, but not with an ear to what was important in the local context. When I talk about a local approach being extremely local, but not having the consistency across or best practice sharing, the example there is Ahold Delhaize, and they have very, very local grocery stores. And they actually hire in a 5-mile radius because they want the individuals to basically shop there, their local foods, the people from the community that are serving customers in the community, which is wonderful. But what happens there is there's a lack of consistency, and they don't sort of roll up or have the benefit of best practice sharing and input from outside of that particular local grocery store. The third approach, which I actually have used in my work, is the transversal approach, which blends the local and the universal, because there's an overarching global strategy that's translated to the local context and has the flexibility and the autonomy to adapt it locally. And so you get some best practice sharing and a consistent global brand. So that's the, make it local. Leaders change to lead change. We all know that, when leaders lead with purpose and passion, you can go from that performative action to sustainable progress, which is so critical. But in order for leaders to lead with purpose and passion, they really have to internalize the benefits of DEI to themselves. And that takes a disruption of their worldview. And it often takes very painful work of introspection. Sometimes it takes, the experience of being a minority in a situation. So, when leaders combine this sort of inclusive mindset and behaviors with actions that demonstrate their commitment, that's really when they can lead with purpose and passion. So, and they have to prioritize DEI to their organization, just as they would with any other initiative. And, I think there were some questions there, Tanya, about also, how do you get leaders on board, right? And how do you, these were questions that were submitted earlier, and how do you get white males to, to promote their self-interest in DEI? So clearly, it takes sort of head and heart strategies. So, it does take data, it takes, people, but ultimately people change because of stories, because of experiences, and because we get to their heart and we have to impact them at an emotional level. So let me just share with you one very quick story. This is a leader in Europe from an organization, and he did not believe in this. He said, this business case, etc., doesn't resonate for me. And then he started mentoring a woman from a different organization. And this woman got laid off. And because they had built a trusting relationship, she shared with him, some of the experiences she had had as a senior executive in the C-suite, being the only woman, and what her experiences were leading up to her being let go. This was the first time this particular leader actually listened and heard what the experiences were of, women in the workplace. And so, he came to me and he said, so it really got to him. He was ready to listen, to learn. He came to me and he said, I really want all of my leaders on my executive team to mentor women, who are, senior executives, and sponsor them actually and help to advance their careers. Now, this was, I shared all the data possible with him. It didn't resonate, but till he had this experience and the stories that she had shared, he was not, willing to buy into it. And I will say that, sharing stories is wonderful, but the burden of sharing lived experiences lies with the individuals who are sharing those lived experiences. And we have to be very judicious in how and when We have individuals share and how we maximize those experiences, but also leaders need to take responsibility for those experiences. So just really quickly, briefly, if you don't mind, the third one is, and it's good business too. And this is about creating a change narrative, because we know that 70% of change initiatives fail without a clearly articulated change narrative. And those, the change narrative can't be sort of siloed or bolted on. It has to be congruent with the mission of the organization, the business of the organization. The fourth principle is go deep, wide, and inside out. We know that organizations are comprised of interconnected systems that work in concert with each other. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion really has to be embedded within all the systems and processes. We have to take that systems approach and not look at things as isolated initiatives, but really holistically. The wide is having a governance structure and a strategy that's scalable, but provides a framework. The deep is having local change agents who can embed and seed diversity, equity, and inclusion deep within an organization. And the inside out is embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in processes and systems, both internally and externally. And the last principle is know what matters and count it. And that's about, I think metrics, highlights problem areas, but also spotlight solutions, and they can be instruments of change. So, but metrics are only useful if you also have accountability. So those would be the 5 principles. Make it local, leaders change to lead change, and it's good business to go deep, wide, and inside out, and know what matters and count it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rohini. I know you shared a lot, and I see there's some great comments in the chat. What I want to invite people who are listening to, one of our hopes, and I think Rohini shares it so well in her stories, is that this is a journey and a dance, right? So she shares quite a number of her challenges and what it means to show up as a leader day in, day out, shift your perspective, shift her own perspective when she went back to India. And so I'm really hoping that people who have joined us who might see that, okay, so Rohini, you are in this big position with so many employees and multinationals, how do I do that? And all of your work was guided by these principles, which enabled you to make decisions and to learn from your decisions in the moment. So thank you for also naming this dance that we make around people sharing the stories and how important that is, and also the toll and what it means to have to share stories when you come from a disadvantage. So really honoring that. And so I'm wondering if we can shift to engaging our audience a little bit. You spoke to some of the challenges, so we would love to hear from you all. We're going to pop up a poll. And so we want to hear from you all about the inequities in your organization or your client's organization. So if you work with organizations that you find the most challenging to address globally. And you can answer as many as as multiple choice, because of course we know that inequities are intersectional. So please feel free to do that. And you'll see that there's a number 8. So if there's something that's not covered there, please write into the chat the number 8 and anything that you want to add. So what we have there is options in the inequities poll. Gender identity is the first one, and this is not in any order, it's just numbered so people can respond. 2 is sexual orientation, 3 is generations, 4 is disabilities, 5 is ethnicity, race, caste, 6 is religion, 7 socioeconomic class, and 8 we see somebody wrote in language into the chat, so feel free to write in some more. Give you a second, we'd love to hear from you. Okay, we're seeing, I'm just going to call a few things out that I see in the chat. So we definitely saw language, family status, political ideology, geographic location, proximity to headquarters, absolutely, cultural norms, facial hair, varying experience levels within an organization. Another one around location to global organization, so that proximity, hierarchical power dynamics related to class, within generations, older workers, caregivers. So I see some people can't see the poll. So you won't see the poll yet. Actually, let's go ahead and let's close it so that everybody can see the responses that we received so far. We also have vaccination status, cultural differences, colorism, immigration status. Quite a wonderful list of additional inequities. So what do we see here, Rohini? We have quite a high number.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Clearly, number 5, ethnicity, race, caste, is the one that folks struggle with the most. And I have to say that this is, something that I struggled with in doing my work. And if there's one regret that I had, it is that I did not do more in this particular dimension, particularly outside of North America. We had started to scratch the surface and doing some work, but I don't think we went far enough. And the way that I found to enter this sort of conversation about ethnicity, race, caste was through the work that we did with refugees in Europe in particular, because many refugees belong to the non-dominant group. And that was a way to really build empathy and to start the conversation. But, as you said, we are intersectional beings, and clearly all of these, they intersect, and, they resonate differently depending on where you are. But if I can just talk a little bit more about, the race, ethnicity, caste one, I think it's just so sensitive and so politically charged. And basically, it's talked about in code, or not talked about at all, which makes it even more difficult. And so, we did make an effort to chip away. And as I said, talking about refugees was sort of the opening for us to have this conversation. But I will say that in light of the viral Black Lives Matter movement going global, I think there is an opening. And, after George Floyd's murder and the video going viral, there were sort of demonstrations all over the world, Australia, Brazil, UK, even places like Japan, Korea, Canada, Germany, etc., which provides an opening for us to do more in this space. But I think what's so challenging about this is that racism is so universal. And someone mentioned colorism. It's so universal, but yet it's so very specific to the local context. And that's why I think, you can't take this sort of, cookie cutter approach to doing this work, because it shows up so differently depending on where you are. And I will say that it's also so incredibly politically charged, which makes it even more difficult to address this. I think that, people talk about it in code. So I know that in Rwanda, you can't, ask someone if they're Hutu or Tutsi, right, Tanya? But if someone points to a church at the side of the road and says that my uncle was killed there, the person is probably a Tutsi, and the uncle was a victim of the genocide. If someone says that, my family fled the Congo in 1994, you can probably guess that the person is a Hutu. So I think there is this code that people talk in, and in order to understand the context and to understand, how people talk about it and the fact that it is so politically charged, you really have to partner with local change agents to help you to navigate. And, that's the only way to really sort of do it. But I think the first part is to understand the resistance, understand the context. And I can sort of share with you my own example from France, for instance, right? So I work for a French company. And initially, I would see French people or Black French people all over Paris but there were very few. There were many in entry-level positions, but very few in senior leadership positions. And initially that caused frustration for me, and I sort of thought that this is something that there's resistance to really naming race and racism, till I understood what the context was. And the context being that in 2018, the word race was removed from the Constitution in France, and no data on race or ethnicity can be collected. But this is a response to World War II and how the Jews were treated, and its attempt to rebuild France after World War II by redefining France as indivisible and not asking for race or religious data so that the state cannot use it to justify action against citizens. So they don't judge individuals by community affiliation, but instead by objective criteria like citizenship and immigration. So my point here is that yes, race, ethnicity, caste is very politically charged. It is universal, but it is very specific. And you have to understand the context and then partner with local change agents to push for change. So this is not about just understanding the context and accepting the status quo. It's about pushing for change, but understanding the context and partnering with individual change agents in order to push for change.
Right. So Rohini, can you share a little bit? There's some questions in the chat, and I know that you wrote about it in your book, which was where do these local change agents come from? And I think, are they internal? Are they external? And I think you also, in your book, you talk about stakeholders. So maybe you can, the deep, wide, inside out. So maybe you can say a little bit there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So these, this is about sort of identifying those change agents wherever you are, right? They may be internal change agents, and they can be, individuals who are, lower in the organization or more senior in the organization. They can also be community members, externally, who can influence your organization. So just a very, very quick story on that, Tanya. When one of my colleagues started leading the business in Saudi Arabia, he started, things were opening up and he started hiring women in Saudi. And he had to abide by the Sharia law, which meant that women had to be in an isolated room. You had to have a male chaperone to go in, that you could only speak through an intercom with the women there. And as the women gained footing, they wanted to participate more in the business. They wanted to participate more in meetings. But the individuals, the conservative individuals, men in that organization said, no, they can only participate if they have a Saudi male to chaperone them. There's no other way they can do it. So the leader in this business basically said, so this is, where you find the change agents, right? So what he said was that, look, you can accompany them to every single meeting if you want, if you have the time to do it, or you find a solution. So they put their heads together, and the men in the organization, in this case, basically decided that it was okay for them to have the meetings if they had the meeting in a room where the door was open and they were sitting at the opposite end of the desk from the men they were meeting with. So small example to show that change agents who know the local culture can come from anywhere, but it's a question of really figuring out who has the influence, who are the stakeholders. Sometimes it's individuals who are the most resistant that can be the change agents. And it doesn't have to be people who are senior in an organization. It can be those, as you said, when you go deep, wide, and inside out, those that are, change agents internally within an organization. There's an example from Canada in the book, where someone from a First Nation actually put in place this practice that encouraged people to share their experiences. And it became something that was adopted by the entire organization. So this can, it can come from anywhere, but you have to, I think, figure out who the influences are. Sometimes it's the key influencers, and they may be from the dominant group. And, sometimes it might seem that, you're seeking validation from the dominant group in order to bring about change, but it's not necessarily seeking validation. It's about using power to upend power also. So, those change agents can come from anywhere, internally or externally. Does that answer the question, Tanya?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more, because oftentimes, and what we did see in some of the questions is, is people are saying, okay, so these change agents and organizations, they're really feeling limited by structural obstacles, or positional power prevents them. People were saying, well, what's your advice if, first step for a diversity officer? And another question was, well, if I was to start doing this work tomorrow, what would it be? And oftentimes people talk about these obstacles as change agents. So I'm wondering if you could say more towards that.
Yeah, I think those are, again, great questions. So I said that, transformation happens at the intersection of the personal and the systemic, and it's work that's ongoing, right? So even if individuals are limited by that positional power, I think that they can change people who then change systems, right? And people can be changed in multiple ways. And actually, there's a whole chapter in the book about how to influence leaders. I talked about the fact that you can use, and I talk about head and heart strategies, right? So data is one way, and data resonates for some people. Also allies, using the dominant group as allies because their messages are heard differently. But, know that you have to do it very intentionally because, this is where you are using that power to upend power. The other one is, you can influence leaders through, and this is a strategy that I use very successfully. When you talk about belonging, sometimes, it's usually only used in the context of belonging to an organizational culture, a sense of belonging to the organization. But there can also be a sense of belonging to a group of clients that are influencers. And if those clients are leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion, then organizations want to belong to that group of clients. So I actually use that extremely successfully to influence managers and leaders within organizations by bringing in clients who they want to sort of imitate or mimic. And these clients would speak about their commitment to DEI, and the organization then would want to emulate what that client was doing. So all that is great, but I think each of us can influence people regardless of where we are in the organization. And I talked about sort of the power of storytelling. If I can just share another, we've all got lived experiences that we can share. And yes, it is painful. And yes, leaders need to take ownership for their own learning. But it can have an impact. The CEO of Sodexo, and I shared this story in the book, when I started doing this work globally, he said to me, why are you diluting the focus? We're focused on gender. Why are you diluting the focus by talking about race, ethnicity? So I knew that I had to expand his learning and really sort of help him understand the centrality of race, particularly in the context of the United States and the history, the civil rights history that we have in this country. So I invited him to a meeting of the African American Leadership Forum, which was an ERG in North America, an employee resource group in North America. And he sat in a breakout where they'd simulated a barber shop and a beauty parlor. For those for whom this may be unfamiliar, these are environments where a lot of sort of stories are shared by African Americans in the United States. So this was their way of saying this is a safe place for us to share stories, and they shared their lived experiences. And he listened to the Black men in that room share their experiences. And he came away really, really moved. First of all, he was one of a handful of white men in that room. And he was certainly the only French man in that room. So it was two experiences: one, listening to the stories, and two, his experience of being a minority that really shifted his perspective. And after that, in all talent discussions, he would ask questions about race and ethnicity. And he would say, yeah, nationality is fine. You say that we have people from different nationalities, but who do we have that's a Black person in this particular leadership team? So, I think I share that to say that regardless of where we are, we can influence those that can influence systems. And then your second question was, what advice do you have for those that are starting off? I think overall, my advice is, just have the courage to speak truth to power. And I think the second piece of advice that I have is do your own work, because we're all a work in progress and we just need to continue doing our own work if we're going to, change and influence others. But for someone stepping into this role, listen, learn. I think that's the first step. Do an assessment where you're listening to multiple perspectives. And then I would say, take a look at, the data that you have available and see where your pain points are. Where are your challenges? And based on where your challenges and your pain points are, then you can come up with solutions. So I think a lot of this initially is really sort of the diagnostic and listening and learning, and then build your relationships and your allies. Figure out who your stakeholders are, including your resistors, and bring them along. So I think those would be some, I'm just saying them in 5 sentences, but this is years of work. So.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And I appreciate you also bringing in personal lives, right? So part of doing your own work, you share stories about leaders learning from what's happening with their wives and in their, if they're from a dominant group, and what's happening in their families, and how we can do the work at home as well as at work.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, you're talking about pain points. So our first poll was engaging the audience around pain points. And so once we know our pain points, we want to also then know, well, how do we hold ourselves and each other and our leaders accountable to some of these pain points? So let's open up the second poll. And so we want to know from you all, how are your leaders being held accountable for DEI outcomes? And Rohini, maybe if you can speak to the different options given your experience.
Yeah, sure. So not held accountable, obviously, is a first. But then in many organizations, it's built into the performance management plan, either as a DEI competency, which is clearly sort of spelled out as to what that means. Very often promotions are dependent on how you're performing on your DEI action plan or your DEI competency. In some organizations, there's a separate sort of incentive pool for diversity, particularly in organizations where they really want to call it out. In other organizations, it's built into that diversity incentive is built into the talent incentive. So it's one of the elements of the talent incentive. But I would just say that it needs to be called out, even if it's part of the talent incentive. It can't just be something about all people. It really does need to be called out. In some really progressive organizations, and I have seen this, that it's linked to stocks. So your performance shares are actually, linked to your DEI plan and your objectives. And then, of course, the other piece is pressure from external organizations to be data transparency, to share your data. That is also making leaders accountable. So this is, just some. There are many other examples, but these are just some examples of how, organizations are holding leaders accountable.
And Rohini, in your example, as somebody was asking, is the incentive tied to the bottom line?
Are incentives tied to the bottom line? Yeah. And I'm not sure what that means exactly, because, in some organizations, it's a complicated answer. So in some cases, these incentives are just based on how you do on your diversity performance. In other organizations, it's how you do on your diversity performance plus how the organization performs financially. Now, I will say in Sodexo initially, the two were decoupled. So it was basically that regardless of how the company does financially, we'll still pay out your diversity bonus because it was so important to the organization. So, that's that. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think it's complex and layered.
One other quick thing, Tanya, if I can just mention this, I think maybe the question was more about, return on investment. Yes, more and more organizations are looking at the connection of diversity and, the bottom line. So return on investment of investing in diversity. And those calculations are also being done in multiple ways. It is complex. So it depends on whether it's sort of customer share or market share in diverse markets, or it's sort of access to clients, so there are very different ways of doing it. Or I think someone put in their retention of employees, because that does convert to a cost benefit ratio. So yes, those analyses are also being done. But this is, the accountability piece. So.
Okay, so I think we can see the majority not held accountable, but then there's quite a bit of answers across the board. So I can't believe it. We have 7 minutes left. Time has flown, and so I can see smiles in the few screens that I can see. This has been incredible. So of course we like to end with, what's the call to action? What do you see as the future? What are you calling us to with your great experience in this moment? What would you like to say to all of us?
Yeah, so I think just, be bold, take a stand, make this work accessible. It can be made accessible, make this work accessible, and embark on your own journeys. I've said a couple of times that transformation happens at the intersection of the personal and the systemic. And I think you can use yourself as instruments of change to impact people. So I think, there's a lot that you can do regardless of where you are in the organization. But I will say that, organizations need to do more. So I think there are sort of 3 areas where I think we can focus. One is at the individual level. We've got to expand our understanding of intersectionality and include socioeconomic class. That is not included in many parts of the world. And I think that needs to be included in the DEI dialogue. As far as organizations go, I think leaders have to eliminate deliberately the systems that have favored some at the expense of others. And they have to disrupt these systems that have supported their success. And what's so sort of tenacious is that they don't even realize that's what's gotten them there. So it has to be, they've got to disrupt these systems even when it's not breaking news, And then at a societal level, I think organizations have to take unequivocal stands. And it's happened, when organizations have taken unequivocal stands, things have changed. I remember in 2016, the North Carolina bathroom bill, as it was called, which required transgender people to use bathrooms in state-run buildings that corresponded to the gender on their license, on their birth certificates. And that was then boycotted by companies, and North Carolina, because it cost them so billions and billions of dollars, they rescinded that bill. So it can be done. But I would just say ultimately the call to action is, change happens. And I love the Margaret Mead quote, if I can remember it. Never doubt that a small group of committed, passionate citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So I think each one of us here can change things in our organizations, in our communities. We have the power to do it. So, and these are the passionate, committed citizens that can make it happen. So that's my call to action.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rohini. And as you'll see in the chat, when you have a second to read it, people are saying they could listen to you for hours. Deep gratitude and thank you for the kindness and the generosity of sharing your experience so transparently, both the wins and the losses. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your book, birthing your book into the world. So I know there's tons of questions, and I was seeing some of them, but a bunch of them, if you want more, there's a lot more in the book, a lot more stories, and there's other ways to engage Rohini to learn more. So thank you, Rohini. Thank you so much to the Khalil Jamieson Consulting Group. Without sponsors like you all, we wouldn't have these free webinars. Also, thank you to the center. If you want to become a sponsor or a donor, which really helps us to shift the world, please click on the link you'll see there in the chat, which is going very wild. Yes, absolutely. Thank you to you all the participants. I just want to, 1 second, Rohini. I do want to say that the next webinar, if you like this and you want to be part of hearing more about artificial intelligence, what DEI professionals need to know, the next webinar on February 16th is with Francesco Carabolanta. So we welcome you to that. Rohini, did you want to say something else?
I just wanted to thank you, Tanya. You've done an amazing job. Really appreciate this. Thank you.